find yourself sitting down to watch something on Netflix, but you can't decide what you want to watch? It's actually really stressful, isn't it? Because you know you want to watch something. That's the worst part. I mean, time-wise, energy-wise, snack-wise. It's a good time to just sit down, watch a movie, and, do that for a while. For me, I definitely find myself kind of endlessly scrolling, and it's almost like the more you scroll, the worse you feel. Say you're scrolling for 25 minutes, that's a quarter of a film, and these titles are coming up, and you're like, no, that's the opposite of what I want to watch. There's something about not having made a decision yet that's kind of uncomfortable or something. But then, out of nowhere, a film pops up, and you say to yourself, that is exactly what I want to watch. It's not one I would have picked for myself. I don't know any of the actors. Story's a bit out there. Could be in a different language. But there's something about the way they've framed it there, and the mood and the music, and you're like, that is exactly what I want to watch. So you feel this kind of relief, right? And you settle in, you press play, decisions made, and a nice story to connect to. What a lovely, lovely feeling. Well, that feeling, that's a little bit what radicalisation feels like. Now, there is more to it than that. Actually, there's quite a bit more to it than that, and I'm sure a lot of radicalised people would call that analogy overly simplistic. And I do know a lot of people who have been radicalised. I don't work for Netflix, that's not my job. I don't think I'm selling it particularly well. My job is to research people who have been radicalised. Some of them I get to speak to, many of them I don't. And I try to understand how it happened, and maybe how to stop it from happening. And actually, it all started here. I earned my stripes at TEDxGalway, where I studied psychology for a number of years, and now I work at Leiden University in the Netherlands, where I conduct research on right-wing radicalisation and what we call Salafi jihadist radicalisation, all in North America. So it is pretty serious stuff. And I probably shouldn't be comparing it to Netflix. Because honestly, all jokes aside, radicalisation is horrific. And I know that I haven't really told you what it is yet, but to be honest, counterterrorism researchers like myself, we all kind of disagree. Some say radicalisation is a political thing, so it's what happens to a person when their political ideas become really extreme and they start to believe things that really go against the grain, like that the Jews control the media, or that the West is at war with Islam, or even that there's a cabal of Satan-worshipping paedophiles who have infiltrated the government and are conspiring against Donald Trump. That's one of the newer ones. Some even say that there's a particular type of person that becomes radicalised, that they're religious, that it's to do with ethnicity, that it's to do with their intelligence, or maybe that they're just evil. I believe there's more to it than that. And I also believe the process, it's more everyday than we might think. One person I had to dedicate a lot of time to last year, and neither I nor any other researcher managed to speak to him, but he was serving in the US military when he became increasingly angry and bitter at his lack of success in finding a girlfriend. So this had actually followed him through his whole life, and it was coming to the stage where he was finding it difficult to reconcile that he might eventually end up alone. Online, he managed to connect with a community of individuals who had had similar experiences, but beyond sharing what had happened to them, they'd come up with a belief system, an ideology to explain why it happened to them. In this belief system, women are viewed as fundamentally inferior to men and designed only for reproductive and sexual function. But the way the world works is viewed as unfair. The game is rigged, and it favours women over men to the extent that in this ideology, women are viewed as mean, manipulative, and very, very cruel. Within this belief system, things like the Me Too movements are seen as a threat to masculinity, but also things, everyday things, like the idea of women wearing yoga pants in everyday life. Whilst I was tracking this person's trajectory, that's what we call it, I noticed, obviously, that he was becoming more misogynistic. That wasn't surprising. I accessed hours and hours of video footage of him that he'd recorded himself, ultimately giving out about women and lots of other things. But the misogynistic stuff, that was expected. But what surprised me was the more I watched, and as time went on, I noticed that his way of thinking, it was becoming more and more uncomplex. The way he rationalized things, it was overly simplistic. One line which really stood out to me, he said, "If I can't find one decent female to live with, I will find many indecent females to die with." Very simplistic. In 2018, he walked into a hot yoga studio in Tallahassee, Florida. With him, he brought a semi-automatic handgun. He pretended he was an attendee at the class, and whilst all the other attendees were lying in child's pose, he opened fire, and he shot 6 people, most of them women. "If I can't find one decent female to live with, I will find many indecent females to die with." And then he shot himself. So what happened? How could I make the argument that that way of thinking is everyday? And what has any of it got to do with Netflix? Well, nobody's shooting anyone because they can't decide what film to watch. But the idea that radicalisation is something that only happens to certain people just isn't true. There is an underlying idea I'm trying to get at here, so let's backtrack a little bit. The word radical originates from the Latin meaning root. Radicals were those people who were said to dig deep and really challenge conventional wisdom, the type of conventional wisdom that would lead to these stuffy, stagnant politics. So radicals, they represented 2 things. The first was novelty. They generally had really new ideas, things people hadn't heard before. But the second thing, the most interesting thing, in my opinion, is that they represented firmness in equal measure. That phrase, "If you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything," that's a radical's bread and butter. Now, as a society, we actually place a great deal of importance on this way of thinking. After all, a person with principles, that's a person to be admired, right? Why? Because they epitomize certainty. And in a world of ambiguity, that's pretty covetable. Think of those little children you speak to, and you ask them what they want to be when they grow up. And first of all, if they know the answer, that's impressive enough, right? But then you find out 10, 15 years later that they're doing exactly what they said they were going to do. And you're like, wow, you didn't change your mind once. That is so impressive. It's a little bit annoying for those of us who don't have traditional career paths. But it's nice to be certain about things, and other people like it too. How many politicians' careers have taken a nosedive because they've changed their mind about something? So you see, what radicals have in common is not necessarily that they're progressive or even extreme, it's that they're certain about something. Now, it's the something that can be problematic. Certainty, or the movement from uncertainty to certainty, is a defining feature of radicalisation. That's what happens when you become radicalised. You systematically eliminate all the uncertainty from your life. And it doesn't really matter who you are. For 20 years, a gentleman named Ted Kaczynski, he lived in a wood cabin in Montana, mailing bombs to government institutions and to universities. He wanted to halt the progression of modern technology. He was a university professor, and he had a PhD in mathematics. Salman Abedi, young 20-something from Manchester, he planted a bomb at an Ariana Grande concert in 2017, seemingly in defense of persecuted Muslims worldwide. And he barely had his A-levels. in any other area where we look at human behavior and we observe such variability, that means that the thing we're looking at is very, very complex. It can't be profiled and it can't be reduced to right versus wrong politics. What these people had in common, it wasn't that they were religious or sick or unintelligent. It was that they moved very, very quickly from uncertainty to certainty. In a world where they knew they wanted to watch a film, but they just couldn't pick, radicalisation offered them one they wanted to watch. So what do we do with this information? Never make a decision about anything ever, because certainty equals shooting people? No, there is more to it than that. You see, during radicalisation, your mind is not working the way it's supposed to, and that's not to say that it's sick. Whether you use violence or not, and to be honest, the vast majority of people who radicalise, they'll never use violence. But it's still a dangerous way to think, because your mind is like a parachute. It only works properly when it's open. So how do we make sure our minds are open and we're not sleepwalking into something potentially dangerous? Well, first we need to check the certainties in our lives and ask ourselves, do we surround ourselves with individuals whose opinions are similar to our own? Every day we sit with thousands of thoughts about how the world works, and while some of them are probably correct, we have to consider the possibility that several of them are likely to be wrong. And you can't do this in an echo chamber. When you're faced with a complex situation, do you immediately know what's right and what's wrong? We're always told that you should follow your gut, but sometimes you need to override it, because the world is chaotic, right? But we put shape on it. Human beings have been doing it for generations, with religion, with science, and in the case of radicalisation, with blaming a whole sector of society for really complex problems. We will do literally anything to eliminate uncertainty from our lives. But whatever shape you put on your world, don't fasten it too tight. And ask yourself, when your mind is made up, how easy is it to change it? And one certainty we can dispel right here is on radicalisation itself. Radicalisation is not rooted in religiosity, ethnicity, intelligence, or even gender. To become radicalised is not to become a terrorist, nor is it to become violent. It is to become rigid. So be loose with your thinking and accept that it may change. It should change. Because loose thinking, these days more than ever, is something the world needs a lot more of. Thank you.